This is the Freewell anamorphic lens for the Mavic Air 2. Now, let me start by saying this lens won't magically make your footage look any better or more cinematic. Light, composition, the right kind of movements, that's what you need to pay attention to, but it does sprinkle a little bit extra cinematicness over your footage. It looks different, and that's what I like about it, because sometimes you just want to go full J.J. Abrams, you know? Widescreen, blue flares everywhere. We're always talking about what gear you really need and don't need, but sometimes you just want to have some fun, and this anamorphic lens does the job. It's actually better than I expected, so I'll show you what it does and how it works. And of course, I'll show you a little bit more of Belgium, where I live here. Let's start with this sequence that I shot last week in a small nature preserve. And if you want to see the whole sequence, check out the video right here because I shortened it. Okay guys, but first a short word on the ethics of this video, because that's important too. Freewell sent me this lens so I can try it out and make a video about it, but they don't pay me, they don't want me to say anything in specific, and they don't want to see the video before I upload it. So there you go. Okay, now anamorphic. A lot of you probably know what an anamorphic lens is and what it does, but for those of you who don't, I'll try to give you a short and simplified explanation. If you want to skip this, just use the chapters or the timestamps in the description. So, anamorphic lenses have been around for a pretty long time actually. They were first used in tanks, so the guys inside could have a wider field of view. And later those lenses, or the concept, found its way to the filmmaking industry. Okay, now what does an anamorphic lens do? Well, let's say back in the old days you wanted to shoot on standard 35mm film because it was cheap and plenty around. That 35mm film had an aspect ratio of 1.375 to 1. That was standard. But what if you wanted a wider field of view? Well, you could use a normal spherical lens and capture everything in a wider aspect ratio, but you'd lose the top and bottom of the frame and also image detail. So the solution was to use an anamorphic lens because it captures a wider field of view, but because the optics are different, it squeezes the image to make it fit on that 35mm film aspect ratio. Then, when projecting the movie in a movie theater, they just used an anamorphic lens to de-squeeze the image. Right now everything's digital, but it still works the same, just with sensors instead of film, and you de-squeeze the footage in post on your computer. Now, you'll probably say, but why use an anamorphic lens then, when we have 8K or even sensors with a wider aspect ratio? The resolutions are so high that it doesn't matter if we lose a bit on the top and the bottom. Well, that's because when you use an anamorphic lens, the image will look a little bit different. There are some anamorphic characteristics. There are the famous or infamous blue lens flares. Some people like them, some people don't. Then there are the out of focus objects in the background that look more elongated, like an oval. And finally, depth of field. Now, although anamorphic and spherical lenses technically have the same depth of field, in practice you'll have to use a longer focal length with an anamorphic lens in order to achieve the same angle of view. Therefore, at the same subject magnification, anamorphic lenses produce a shallower, more cinematic depth of field. So, that's the simple explanation of what an anamorphic lens does, what it is. Now, this little thing here, the Freewell anamorphic lens, is just a simplified design of an anamorphic lens. You can't really compare it with a cinematic anamorphic lens. So it's not the same as a real anamorphic lens for a cinema camera, but it does capture a wider field of view and then squeezes the image onto the sensor of your Mavic Air 2, but there are no oval out of focus objects, for example. You do get the blue lens flares though. So it's a more simple version of an anamorphic lens, but that doesn't really matter at all. So, like I said, this lens won't make your footage look any better. It's just different, and it will add a little movie feel to your footage. It won't make your footage look more cinematic necessarily, because that's all about flying your drone and getting the right movements, the light. This lens will just add an extra layer because of that wider field of view and the aspect ratio. Last week I shot a sequence that'll show you what I mean by movie feel. Just know that I shot this footage in extreme low light. Everything is ISO 1600, so the footage is a little bit more noisy than usual. But I really don't mind for this kind of footage. Looks cool, right? And yeah, sure, you could shoot this without an anamorphic lens, but it just gives you that little extra. The wider field of view, full sensor, I like it. And then there are the blue lens flares. Now, it's not easy to catch them and make them look good, but when you do catch one, it does look pretty cool. I really like them. Just not all the time, but once in a while, yeah. It's just that, I don't know, I think those blue lens flares look better when you're shooting in a city, for example. Not in a small nature preserve. It depends, and it's also highly subjective because some people don't like them at all. This lens also doesn't soften the image a lot, maybe a little bit, but I find that the footage of the Mavic Air 2 is too sharp anyways, so I like a little bit of softening, but it's not a lot. Almost not noticeable for me. So I really like this anamorphic lens, but there are a few things that I don't like. First, it does distort the horizon quite a bit sometimes. You can see it especially in the top corners of the image. Especially when you pitch up and down in the top and bottom of the frame. But it doesn't bother me that much. And I also don't know if this is something they could fix by making a different design or something like that. That's also why the blue flares are not straight all the time. Sometimes they have a little arc. And second, you can't put an ND filter on top of this lens, so you always have to crank up the shutter speed. It would be nice if they could make a version with the possibility of adding an extra ND filter on top of the lens. Super easy to use it, it's just like an ND filter actually, so let's try it. To take off whatever's on there, just turn it counterclockwise and then turn clockwise to put on the anamorphic lens. Just make sure that it's leveled horizontally. I found that I had to use a little bit more force than usual to get that last click, you know? So be careful. Okay, so I'm not sure here. I mean, I know how to desqueeze the footage, but I found different aspect ratios and percentages in different videos on YouTube for this lens. For all the footage in this video, I stretched the footage horizontally to 1.15. That's what one of the videos I found said. Now, I double checked by taking a shot of something round and then stretching it again until it's a full circle. And it seems to me it's more like 1.13. Either way, we're somewhere around an aspect ratio of 2:1. I would say just do the test with a round object to make sure how much you should stretch the image. So there you go, the Freewell anamorphic lens. A lot cheaper than other brands out there, but that's actually why I like it, because it's not something that you really need, you know what I mean? Maybe the quality is not the same as those more expensive brands, but I think it gives you good value for money, this lens. If you have a Mavic Air 2 and you want this one, check out the link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.
Tide coming, yeah, but I want water to my neck. Tide coming, yeah, but I want water to my neck. I wanna drown inside this. I wanna drown inside this. Go down an eye, like I captain. I never had a vibe this vibrant. Then we're also shiny with that 3-eye vision. Take this moment, I'ma die inside it. I am pariah, I am Mariah. Words they carry, don't trust the silence. Gotta fill it all up, like.